Stephen Quayle is an author. He's been a guest of Coast to Coast with Art Bell. He's been with me. He's an author of a book called Breathe No Evil. It's a book for understanding bioterrorism. Now, additionally, he has authored Blueprint for Survival, Investment Perspectives on Precious Metals, and Aliens and Fallen Angels. Stephen Quayle has completed his latest book, Genesis 6 Giants, Master Builders of Prehistoric and Ancient Civilizations. He's a former editor, publisher of Survival Quest and Security and Survival Chronicles, monthly newsletters that dealt with perilous events and how to prepare for them. He continues to shout from the rooftops his concern for massive loss of life due to lack of civil defense and preparation in the public and private sectors. We always turn to him here on Coast to Coast with these kinds of issues. But this time, a different twist. For more than 30 years, he has been researching and investigating the influence and relevance of supernatural hybrids known as giants. And I've got to tell you, Stephen, fascinating perspective. How did you get involved in this one?
Well, interestingly enough, George, it was through, I guess you'd say, a dissatisfaction in college with classic anthropology. There were too many question marks, and so I started to investigate just the North American accounts of the giant skeletons that were found in the Ohio and Pennsylvania Valley. I'm talking everything from 10 to 12-foot tall guys found in copper armor. And the more I investigated, I found out it was a worldwide situation where we're talking some really big skeletons, all the way up to 36 feet tall.
If we only had basketball then, huh?
Well, I can tell you this, when some of these guys, some of the British giants, for instance, one guy specifically, listen to this, a guy by the name of William Joyce in the late 1800s, he could lift a ton dead weight, in other words, 2,000 pounds. And that you're only talking about a guy that was 8 feet tall. So I think the situation that most people find in history is there are too many question marks. And when you're looking at the temples of the world, and you're looking at all of the, what would you say, the answers that are out there that seemingly are, swept under the rug, I think it becomes apparent that for some reason, someone doesn't want the issue of giants brought up, and that's why I spent 3 decades dealing with it. And as you know, the book has got on the front cover a British explorer with 2 12-foot giants from Kashmir standing over him. Now, again, this was in the late 1890s, and as early as 1970, in the jungles of the Amazon, there have been actual reports of people running into very shy natives who are in excess of 9 feet tall.
How tall do you think the little guy is in the middle on your cover of your book, Genesis 6?
According to they claim he's right at 6 feet. When I got that from a group of people in London that have the only photos of these guys around. Also in the book, I have a picture of a 12'2" Irish mummy, and it's fascinating because later in the show we can get into the mummy issue. But the point that's fascinating is if you take guys that are all the way up to 36 feet tall, 20 feet tall. The Emperor of China had 2 15-foot guards. Charlemagne himself was surrounded by rather large individuals. We have a Roman emperor named Maximinius who was a giant himself. His wife's bracelet, George, would fit around his thumb. We're talking about people that are, we're talking about people with big egos, big appetites, and incredible strength. We're not talking about the medical situation that you see sometimes on the History Channel where they show giants as being these guys that don't live very long, obviously like Andre the Giant, who was a wrestler. Right. We're talking about guys with unbelievable strength, unbelievable knowledge, and unbelievable wisdom. On the website, I even show some of the Incan kings, I-N-C-A-N, Inca, from the Inca Empire, basically in the museums of Peru, that have 4 to 5 times the cranial mass of a standard human skull. So we're not only talking about big guys, we're talking about people with incredible intelligence, and we're talking about an answer that obviously classical anthropology and archaeology, these guys don't want to deal with this. I think it was David Hatcher Childress that coined the word Smithsonian Gate. In other words, a cover-up of history that's rather pronounced. And when you begin to dig, as I began digging over 30 years ago, you can find out that the reports of newspapers in America, of newspapers around the world. Interestingly enough, after I did the last show with Art, somebody went on the website and they sent me from Eastern Europe, they've already sponsored I guess you'd say an undertaking to go into some of the caves where they found a whole, basically, cavern of giant skeletons. And in the New Ancient American, which is a magazine that's put out in America, they found the most contemporary find. It's someplace in desert Southwest, and it actually shows the pictures of the giants, shows the cave, etc. So basically, interestingly enough, too, is that when you look at this, you see that there is a very, very, how should I say, skittish archaeological base out there that doesn't even want to deal with this.
Well, do you think, Stephen, that these giants were regular offsprings of people, or that they popped up in a very unusual way, depending on the percent of population at the time?
Well, first of all, I believe that the reason I use Genesis 6, let me read this and then I'll comment.
All right.
Genesis 6, 1, 2, and 6 are kind of interesting because it gets into the whole alien, the whole Nephilim, the whole Zechariah, Sitchin, Anunnaki, but let me read it. It says this: "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all of which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children unto them, the same became the mighty men which are of old, men of renown." Now, there are two opposing viewpoints on this. During about the 4th century A.D., the Catholic Church basically said, well, no, these were the sons of Seth, and the sons of Seth married the daughters of Cain, and out of good men marrying bad women came giants. We're talking about men, George, that had 6 fingers, 6 toes, and double sets of teeth. Now, that's kind of interesting because all through the digs in North America, especially in Catalina in California, Lompoc, where there's a prison in California, they found red-haired giants, 10 to 12 feet tall, double sets of teeth, 6 fingers, 6 toes. You go to South America, and the Mayan god Shambhalum had 6 fingers, 6 toes. And so I believe there is a supernatural element, and then you've got writers who claim that we were created by the aliens, the Anunnaki, and I obviously I don't believe that. I believe that all the myths of history center around this one thing, that basically supernatural beings had sex with earth women and produced giants. And it's in the Bible, it's in Genesis 6, Jude 6, 2 Peter, but more than that, and in addition to that, it's all through history.
So you believe that these giants are the offspring of
fallen angels.
Fallen angels from way gone back.
Well, from way gone back. And it gets into the interesting thing. You know, if we go into, let's say, Greek mythology, we've got satyrs, and satyrs was a goat-like body, a human torso, and ram's horns.
Yes.
We've got centaurs, head and torso of a man, lower half of a horse. Cyclops, giants with one eye in the center of the forehead. And by the way, 2 months ago in Indonesia, there were actual cyclopean skulls found, one eye, giant, and immediately the standard, if you will, anthropological community came out and said, oh, these are just basically calcified remains of a normal skull. We've got tritons, mermaids, minotaurs, chimeras or chimeras, and it's interesting because there's actually a patent now with the U.S. Patent Office that combines human DNA and animal DNA. So when we've got a supernatural element inserted into the equation of, in essence, fallen angels even having sex with animals, and by the way, this is ancient Sumerian text, it's ancient Babylonian text. This is something that is through history. It begins to explain a lot of where the myths came from.
Let's get into Genesis if we can, without the biblical and religious twist to it.
Sure,
but
I'm
really
talking about it from a historic aspect.
Exactly, and let you interpret some of this for us, because it is there for people to read, and you've been able to pull that out when you have written about it in your book. But it is there, and it has gone on since the beginning of time here, hasn't it?
It has, and you know, it's interesting because, again, you know, basically you have from just the Genesis account of these fallen angels having sex with earth women, producing, again, a race of incredible people. You know, everybody's heard of David and Goliath,
yes.
But what they don't know is that Goliath had, you know, 4 brothers, and these guys all had 6 fingers, 6 toes. There's a guy named Og, O-G, not a hard name to remember, and some scholars place him at 18 feet tall. So from the Genesis account in the Old Testament through all of the history, the historical accounts, through the different continents, whether you're dealing with South America, whether you're dealing with North America, the Europeans, the Asians, the Australians, the Greeks, everybody has got their records, their bones. And, interestingly enough, the Aztecs, and there was a lot of chronicling of the Aztecs by different Spaniards that followed, especially their priests that followed the conquistadors. And basically, the Aztecs said their entire civilization was built by giants. Tiwanaku in Bolivia, up by Lake Titicaca. The point is that they have fantastic architecture that still no one can explain. Baalbek, the giant cities of Bashan, Bashan, which were called the cities of the giants. So I'm talking about a time period when there were some really big guys. And see, in classic anthropology, classic archaeology, this stuff is basically taboo. They won't deal with it. And it's fascinating because when you go even to 1905 in the Phoenix Gazette, there are actual full front page stories about a gentleman from the Smithsonian named Kincaid who actually found caverns with giant statuary from Egypt, etc. And when people have tried to investigate, David Hatch, Childress, and others, I mean, it's fascinating. They hit a dead wall. It's kind of like the scene, on Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark gets placed in a giant warehouse only to be forgotten. So I think it's time for this stuff to come out, because what I'm concerned about, and again, we can get to that, is the genetic engineering consequences of this. The British Museum a couple of years ago had an interesting article. They said, can Ramses II live again? We all remember the theme of Jurassic Park. DNA obviously brought back the dinosaurs. But now we're talking about the possibility of bringing back, long lost men of renown, and it's fascinating. I believe the Human Genome Project has a lot more, what would they say, the sinister purposes than most people might imagine.
Well, why is it taboo for mainstream science to do a good investigation into giants, how they got here, and where they are today?
Well, I think primarily because, number one, they don't want to have to deal with the religious issue. And when I say religious issue, obviously the most detailed account of it is in Genesis chapter 6, Jude, 2 Peter. There's a lot of places that deal with it in the Old Testament. Second of all, it kind of throws a kink or a chink in their armor as far as just following a chemically determined plan of evolution. They can't account for it. The supernatural aspect of it, I think, really scares them big time.
Well, you may be right about that. And let me ask you this, Stephen. Are there giants on the planet today, much like what we see on the cover of your book?
Yes, and interestingly enough, really interestingly enough, I don't know if you've ever read any of Barry Chamish, Chamish, or some people pronounce his name Shamish, from Israel, but he's got a book called Return of the Giants, and he's got, George, at least probably 24 eyewitness accounts of, and this is what's going to blow a lot of people's mind, 9.5-foot giants getting off of flying saucers running around, which some people call the Pleiadians.
Whoa.
Now, again, if you're dealing with the supernatural, and again, for people that don't believe in the supernatural, they're going to say, oh, man, this guy's whacked out. But if you look at the history of these guys from Europe, the North American giants, I mean, we've got a situation that's just amazing. Everybody from Coronado, Magellan, you name the great explorers of history, encountered these guys. The very name Patagonia, which everybody knows is a clothing line now from South America, the Patagonians mean Bigfoot. And I have on my website an interesting account from the Gentleman's Gazette, written in, I think, 1767. And that's pretty close to the time when Magellan actually encountered these people. And once Magellan encountered them, everybody went to see them, and then they started encountering them all over the world. So I think the interesting thing about this is that, if you listen to classic history, some miracle happens, so many thousand years BC in Sumeria, and all of a sudden men are given all kinds of knowledge and understanding that no one can explain. I kind of look at it like Solomon did. He said, the thing that has been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. We talked to different people who are Indian scholars from the continent of India, and, they basically have got in the Mahabharata, the epic poem, they've got Vimanas, which are the flying ships. I mean, it's fantastic. The battles, George, are so succinct and so detailed that you'd think you were basically in the 21st century, and it's World War III time.
Stephen, what do you think their personalities, personalities were like? Were they good people? Were they evil?
Yeah, very evil. It's interesting because, first of all, they're the ones that introduced cannibalism. You know, as I've studied every continent, and again, in my book, by the way, it's 480 pages, and as you know, George, it's got every account, who documented it, so I think it's above reproach when you're dealing with 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century eyewitness accounts that are validated by, second and third witnesses. But their personality was kind of interesting. When Caesar was encountering them in his campaigns in Europe and stuff, their voice was so shrill that it sounded like, as one chronicler said, it sounded like the voice of a harpy. Another thing is that their prowess, if you will, they lived to fight and die. In the book, I chronicle some pretty gruesome, we don't need to go into it, but some of the gruesome habits these guys have, and basically they were pretty horrific people. Now, those were the six-finger, six-toes guys. It seems like, too, that the larger, normal people, though, there were some pretty incredible people. Most people don't realize King Arthur is considered a giant by a lot of the writings, obviously of the Arthurian legend. Even, guys like, I said Charlemagne. Interesting. He stood 8 feet tall, and he had a whole...
How tall was Arthur?
9 feet.
King Arthur was 9 feet tall?
Yep.
No wonder it was easy for him to pull that sword out of the rock when he was a kid.
Yeah, it sort of puts a whole new twist on history. And, this is fascinating because, again, when you're talking about, what can a power lifter nowadays, a weightlifter, do? Really, can they do like 400 pounds dead, straight lift? I don't know. But when you're talking about guys that could do, a ton dead weight with one hand, it makes some megaliths and monoliths and a lot of the buildings that are around the world come into focus. If an 8-footer can do that, what can a 25-and-a-half-footer do?
We've all heard the story of Adam and Eve. I wonder, and we'll check in with guest Stephen Quayle, is Adam and Eve were actually giants? More to come. I'm George Norrie in for Art Bell. This is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast, George Norrie with guest Stephen Quayle. Stephen, I was told that the Sumerians had a counting system based on 6, and when you talk about 6 fingers and 6 toes, I go, maybe there's something to that. Did you know that?
Yes, and interestingly enough, when you see the Sumerian king that's seated on his throne in the standard stele, or basically the bas-relief, if you notice him, he's got very slender legs, and if he were to stand up, he would overtower by a factor of at least 2 to 1 the guys that are serving him. It's the standard Sumerian seals inscription. So, interestingly enough, when you look at the Sumerian pantheon, it's been stated that even, George, this will blow your mind, even in the halls of the military and the Pentagon, when they encounter unidentified flying objects of a specific kind, they refer to them as the gods of the Sumerians returning.
That does blow my mind.
Yeah, and I mean, Liz, how about this? Everybody knows Buffalo Bill Cody, interesting, colorful figure from the West. Now, here's just kind of like a really interesting little snippet, okay? The North American Indians believe that the first race of human beings were giants. And interestingly enough, in a story in the autobiography of Buffalo Bill Cody, Cody writes that while camping on the South Platte, a Pawnee Indian came into the camp with what the Army surgeon pronounced to be a giant thigh bone of a human being. Asked about where such a bone might have come from, the Indian replied that long ago a race of giants had lived in the area. The race of men had been, according to the stories handed down by the tribe, 3 times larger than normal men. And listen to this, and were able to outrun a buffalo and even carry it once they captured the creature. Now, that might sound unbelievable to some people, but then you can actually go into the Roman historians who talk about Maximinius, that's the guy I referred to earlier. Listen, he could outpull a chariot with a team of horses, and he's the guy that was so big, he could outrun a horse at full gallop.
Well, a horse goes at a 30-mile-an-hour clip.
You got it. So, you know, you take the standard stride of a normal man, and you get the feeling. By the way, this Maximinius had a phenomenal appetite. He ate 40 pounds of meat a day and drank 6 gallons of wine. and see, these are what are interesting in the book, and I want to share with people. In the book, I've documented over hundreds and hundreds of hundreds. Literally, I'm approaching 800 or 900 different incidents of the giants in history. And not only with the anecdotes, but with just who wrote it, where they wrote it. And if you want to understand that, when you look at the history, for instance, of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas, the Aztecs had their god Quetzalcoatl, which was a giant that came from the east. It's why the conquistadors were able to conquer Montezuma, because he was looking for the prophecies. And these guys were big, they were smart. And this is, if you go to Viracocha, you go just down the coast, basically, from Mexico into South America, and you get into the Mayans, and then you get into the Incas. It's fascinating. They all inherited giant cities that they did not build.
Steve, take us back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. Were they giants, or were they about our size?
Well, basically, interesting, there's a French book called Les Giants, and forgive my French, but they claim that Adam and Eve were much taller, around 7 to 8 feet. Now, again, we got to separate between, let's say this, normally larger people, and obviously everything from gravity to a different density of the atmosphere would have affected that. But what I'm talking about, the supernatural, the Nephilim, in other words, the fallen angel. And by the way, George, you know, we talked about it. Nowhere in the Old Testament do sons of God refer to normal people. In the book of Job, it's always the Benai Elohim, and you know, Sitchin and others have stretched that to mean the Anunnaki. It means literally the angels, and it talks about them being able to basically shapeshift. And every obelisk, let me tell you something that's kind of interesting. Every obelisk in history, they're found throughout the world, all, and when I say this, I don't mean to sound like a pun, but it points to the fact that the angels were able to take on themselves, you know, human sexual features and procreate. Some people have a really hard time with that, but every time you see an obelisk, even the one in Washington, that's what the real history of it is. It's not just, oh, gee, this is a nice monument. It's absolutely commemorating the fact that a specific group of angels, and, you know, interestingly enough, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found at Qumran, the Book of Enoch, which is what's called a pseudepigraphal work, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it backs up so much of what Genesis 6 and other passages in the Old Testament teach, and some people just absolutely cannot handle that.
Well, how many giants, percentage-wise, of the population, not total number, but percentage-wise, do you think inhabited the planet back in the biblical days?
Well, that's a good question, because, you know, you've got Joshua and Caleb, who took over leading the Hebrews out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Pretty much everybody they encountered, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, everybody, the Zanzamin, everybody that they encountered was a giant. So I would say this, that when you're talking about the area of Canaan, when you're talking about the Middle East, I would say, based on what I've been able to determine, pretty much 50 to 60% of who they encountered were giants. And they all, you know, it's interesting because in Joshua, he's talking about the spies that went into the Promised Land, and they said it's a horrible land, for the land devours its inhabitants. In other words, when the giants couldn't satisfy their appetite, and this is true throughout the world, you know, when they could not be fed enough, that's when they started eating people. And it's fascinating because the history of cannibalism, I don't want to sound gruesome, but is directly related and traceable to the giants.
Well, if 50% of the population happened to have been giant in those days, why is that percent way down now to a point of probably less than 1%?
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, it's important to understand that and every listen to this, every continent, every place, it seems like the giants ended up fighting. I mean, we're talking about battles with the Romans where 200,000 and 300,000 of these giants were killed in a single battle. Those are big battles, okay?
Huge battles.
Huge battles. And again, I think the problem with most people is that history has become dull and boring, and if you watch, you know, Jay Leno, and he goes out on the man in the street, and, you know, most people can't even place the continents any longer. You know, I mean, when I'm sure you've been amazed, George, haven't you, at the people being asked just basic, simple questions, and they get this kind of, you know, starry-eyed glare into the world, and they can't answer the simplest of questions. I'm saying that to say this, that obviously I think history is rich with answers, and I think the skeptics are out there because, quite candidly, people have failed to take up their challenge to be able to answer a lot of these situations. Look, in the Temple of Saqqara in Egypt, you have absolute hieroglyphics that you cannot get away from that are unusual in the fact that, I mean, they look like Cobra helicopters. You know, David Hatcher Childress, I mean, goodnight, Graham Hancock, Robert Bivall, John Anthony West. Some of these guys are phenomenally brilliant. You know, Graham Hancock's gotten a lot of heat, but he's probably one of the smartest people in the world. And when he's gone and done his stellar projections, each and every one of the, like the Great Pyramid of Giza and everything, and they line up with stellar coordinates that are back 12,500 years old.
Assuming, though, Stephen, all this is correct,
right,
and that we did have in those days many, many giants of unbelievable height. I mean, I think at one point Edgar Cayce believed that those from Atlantis were extremely tall. I mean, ridiculously tall. But assuming all this is correct, your work is correct, what does that mean? What's the bottom line here with giants?
The bottom line is they're coming back. The bottom line is their DNA has already been cultivated. There are laboratories that this thing is, how do I say this? This thing is of, no pun intended, but of biblical proportion in the ramification, you know. We're talking about a lot of things happening. You know, as you know, before Malachi Martin died and Art did the phenomenal interview he did with Father Malachi Martin, Malachi Martin made a statement. He said, imagine the very worst thing you can think of, and then multiply it by, what do you say, 100 or 1,000 times?
Yes.
And that's how bad it's going to get. There has been a real attempt, especially by certain elements within the Catholic Church, to withhold the third secret of Fatima. We're talking about the giants coming back. We're talking about genetic engineering experiments. We're talking about things like the soul catcher chip. Have you ever heard about the soul catcher chip?
I have not heard that one. Tell me about that.
Let me tell you what the soul catcher chip is, okay? It's basically developed by British Telecom, and the chip is to be implanted behind the eye, and where it records, listen to this, George, every waking moment of a person's experience. According to the researchers developing the chip, this information will then be combined with cloning techniques to create a duplicate of the original person. Now listen to this, quoting. He said, this is the end of death. By combining this information with